Welcome and thank you for attending today's webinar, What Does Scanning Orchestration Mean and Why Should HIT Security Professionals Care? Sponsored by Medigate and presenting with our partner Rapid7 and customer Torrance Memorial Medical Center. I have a few announcements before we get started. If you need technical assistance during today's event, please type your issue into the questions box, which is located to the right of the slides window, and click the submit button. You can use the same box to submit questions to the speakers at any time. We will be addressing audience questions in a QA session at the end of today's event. The questions box has multiple tabs where you can view any handouts for today's session, as well as the abstract, speaker information, and access your certificate of completion. Finally, you will receive an email by the end of the day with a link to a replay of this webinar as it becomes available. And with that, I will hand things over to Thomas Finn, Director of Business Development at Medigate. Tom, you have the floor.
Well, thanks so much, Martina. And again, welcome everyone. My name again is Tom Finn. I'm the Director of Business Development for Medigate. And I'm joined today by our technical expert from Rapid7, Justin Prince, as well as Todd Felker, the Director of Information Security for Torrance Memorial. We will endeavor to answer the questions posed on the title slide. So let's go ahead and get right into it. We talk a great deal about bridging the gaps, or the need to bridge gaps between the traditional silos that have emerged in healthcare. From an integrated asset management and cybersecurity perspective, the silos we're most interested in here are those of IT and security, obviously teams that are focused on protecting the privacy and integrity of the hospital's infrastructure. These days, it's a lot to do with managing the data flows, given the explosive growth in Internet of Medical Things, medical devices. Biomed and clinical engineering are naturally more attuned to making sure that these devices are in good working order and that they are safely integrated to patient care. And then, of course, and perhaps less intuitively, there are the operational needs of the business. We could think in terms, let's say here, of supply chain and procurement from a capital planning perspective, the manner in which they rationalize their suppliers around the devices that are being used on clinical networks. There are all sorts of needs up to and including, of course, the need to record the kinds of information, the kind of data required to accelerate revenue cycles, make sure that the health system is paid. Of course, the goal at the end of the day is operational efficiency. Why? Because any sort of programmatic approach to asset management and cybersecurity requires a team effort. Risk reduction practice must deliver business value. Otherwise, the programs that are being developed are not going to be sustainable. Let's just again consider the business perspective here. We're talking about medical device growth at a compounded annual rate of 20%. That's not just representative of massive spending. That is representative of a huge revolution in the manner in which care is going to be delivered in the future. Value-based care is also determining how hospital systems will be reimbursed. In fact, alternative payment models have already emerged and are already determining how many hospitals are paid. Certainly in the future, it's going to be pervasive. Now, if we pivot to more specifically the challenges of vulnerability management, with regard to clinical networks, we've seen an awful lot of development over the last few years. If I break it down to visibility 1.0, that was all pretty much about discovery, identifying devices. Visibility 2.0, more about discovery, device identification, and partial attribution. We were starting to get better at it. We're now at a place now where 3.0 means full attribution of all of the devices connected to clinical networks, full detail around their network posture, their security posture. We're also in a position now, especially given, for example, Medigate's dedication to healthcare, to do the work offline to enrich that same data to ensure its relevancy to a cross-functional group. We do so by gaining an understanding of the workflow requirements of the device, for example, understanding at such levels of detail what the device needs in order to perform its mission, that we can correlate vulnerabilities appropriately. We can auto-generate remediation instructions. We've even gotten to the point now where we're able to generate network policy because we are indeed sitting on the full context of each connected asset. Well, from a VM perspective, that means that we are in a position to provide identity or support identity-based scanning. And this is important in healthcare, again, a nuance of the industry as clinical networks host medical devices and sensitive devices that cannot be actively scanned without, for example, violating manufacturer warranties. It's simply not safe for the equipment. It's not safe for the patients. The intel that we can provide to Rapid7, for example, genuinely, I should say, changes the game. Again, I want to focus in on the cross-functionally relevant clinical context that is delivered via our integration to Rapid7, as it really does change the game in terms of how scanning practices from an administrative perspective are administered going forward. So with that, I'll turn it over to our expert. Justin, why don't you take it from here?
Thank you, Tom. When we talk about vulnerability risk management or VRM, as you see in the center of the screen there at Rapid7 with our customers, we talk about an ongoing, ever-living process that looks a little something like this. And it's going to be a little different for all organizations. All networks are different. All teams' goals are different. But it's a cycle of establishing some initial visibility. It leads into some form of assessment. Typically we're talking about vulnerabilities, but policy, misconfiguration related assessments, things like that. Just good old fashioned information harvesting from your environment to learn a little bit more. It should lead very smoothly into a prioritization and remediation process. And as you can see, it's something that we want to constantly measure throughout, both to course correct, to fix things as needed, but also to show progress. And usually teams focus on a lack of progress, which is a very easy way to lose buy-in and have the wheels fall off. But what we want is a way to measure throughout, show that we're achieving our goals. And it all starts with that initial visibility and the assessment. And adding that context, it's something that we need to do as automatically as possible. And you'll often hear, I apologize, the dogs always know when I'm on a webinar. If we have incoming data, we need a way to handle it automatically without going in manually, dealing with spreadsheets. That's the bane of a lot of information security programs, though they may have their place. We don't have trouble collecting information. We have trouble doing something with it. So when we go into the challenges with VM, especially as it relates to your IoMT, your Internet of Medical Things, your Internet of Things, is we've got core foundational information security. VM is 100% essential to a program. It's not all-encompassing of information security. As I mentioned on the previous slide, what I was alluding to is you should be doing it, but you should be spending all of your time doing it. And it absolutely can't exist in a vacuum. You need to have context on your targets, your environment. You need to understand what you're scanning, what you shouldn't be scanning, when you should be scanning it, how you're scanning it, things like that. And it comes down to coordination between teams. Tom mentioned silos, and one of our main goals at Rapid7 is breaking down those silos between teams, getting out of that age-old approach of InfoSec does the scans, and then they throw those reports over to the other teams and they say, make this report smaller by 50% or 90% or 100%. What does that really mean? It's not a good relationship to, when we're based just on that fear of not reducing some count of things. So we're talking about working amongst these teams. We're talking about understanding each team's goals. Again, traditionally with InfoSec, when we're talking about IT, we're talking a lot of uptime. We're talking about absolutely business critical systems, but historically we haven't been talking about patient care. We haven't been talking about devices that might be, sustaining or assisting with human life. So we need to understand the use case from the business side, from those clinical teams, from those biomed teams. Their number one job is not necessarily a reduction of risk in the traditional InfoSec and IT sense. Remediation isn't always push button receive patch. It could be other forms of mitigation. It could be compensating controls. And at the end of the day, it could be some level of risk acceptance. I'm fond of saying that it's not risk elimination. It's not vulnerability elimination. It's a management. It's understanding what we can do, how far we can go to reduce risk without impacting the business. And that business becomes, very interesting and challenging when we talk about these clinical environments. So a couple quick kind of refreshers for a lot of folks who are familiar with bone management, or maybe some tidbits as to how the inner workings of the solution can help you from a bone management perspective. And when we talk about establishing that initial visibility, most folks are familiar with a good old-fashioned network scan. I'm going to take a scan engine or a piece of software. I'm going to point it at some bit of my environment or all of my environment, and I'm going to tell it, go out and find what you can, figure out what's alive, figure out maybe some device characteristics, and report that back to me. And there's various levels of tuning you can do depending on the solution you're using. With Insight VM at Rapid7, we have everything from your unauthenticated discovery scans. We can do authenticated discovery where we'll actually fingerprint authentication services, and we'll use credentials that you provide. And we'll go a level deeper. We'll pull a list of software. We'll do things beyond just remote checks and TCP/IP stack analysis. Again, things that folks who have experience with vuln management, I'm preaching to the choir there. You can also do a discovery as part of the vulnerability or the policy related scan. You don't have to do discovery for discovery's sake. You can just bootstrap that into a normal scan. Hey, I've got a subset of assets I want to scan. Of course, that first step is going to be, let's go out and discover. Let's see what's out there to maybe run some vulnerability checks or policy related scans, your CIS, your disastigs, things like that. We've also got the concept of dynamic discovery connections. And what those do are, it kind of fast tracks you through your vulnerability scan by querying other systems of record. And you see a few examples here, your AD, your DHCP, VMware, for folks deployed in the cloud, your AWS, your Azure, systems that InfoSec is generally aware of, but might not have direct access to. And it's a win-win in the sense that IT could provision maybe access for the solution to query these systems. You don't have to worry about going in and wondering what we're missing, because we're asking, the system of record. DHCP, who have you provisioned an IP address to? Rather than go out and do a discovery scan, just tell me who's on the network at any given time. And as you get into more ephemeral hosts, things that come and go, the VMware, the AWS, the Azure becomes all the more appealing because we can just get those in closer to real time. You think of a network scan as a snapshot of your environment, but a scan can take many hours. You can point a scan at a Class A network rich with live IPs. It's going to take quite some time to chew through and discover all of those things. And by the time the scan ends, you might have things that have already changed, especially in those heavily dynamic environments. Devices are coming and going. Mobile workforce laptops have always been something we talk about a lot at Rapid7. But you get into the hospital scenarios where you've got a cart with 7 devices, some embedded, some IoMT, IoT, but maybe a workstation or a laptop involved. Those things are whizzing around. You're not really sure where they are at any given time. So this is a way to fast track through discovering them. And that last piece is kind of a, do as you will. We've got an API where we can both create scan targets and update and run scans against assets or subsets of assets. And those last two are key, because what we're able to do is, and we'll actually show it in just a few moments with Medigate, is leverage those to orchestrate through that whole process. Now that's your visibility. When it comes to assigning some context, and we do some built-in risk scoring, I'll always say you've got to have some quantification. You've got to have a number to reduce that number. And it's in a lot of cases, it's arbitrary to your environment and to your goals. It means as much as you want it to mean. And as a trusted partner in your security program, we want to give you an idea of what's risky, what's more risky, what's less risky, and give you that whole spectrum. What we want you to be able to do is add additional context, and you can do it in a couple ways. One, from an organizational piece, you can drop assets into groups. Asset groups can be static or dynamic, and they're really good for things like site scoping. You can create an asset group that says, put all of my Windows devices into a group, and then scan that group on Wednesday nights. You can be a little more mindful and efficient with the resources you have deployed for your VM program. You can also use it for least privilege, for RBAC, role-based access, where you say, look, maybe Tom, I only want to see those Windows devices, but Justin and Todd get the benefit of handling Linux and everything else. We can only serve up those devices to the appropriate individuals and teams. Asset tags are good for the true business context. It could be purely organizational. It could be who owns this asset, where is it located. We use custom tagging, as we'll see in just a moment. We also use risk score adjustments via criticality tags. The use case I always use is if you've got two identical devices, but one is your test device, it's out of rotation, the other one's live, it's doing its job. You don't necessarily want to handle risk or the understanding of risk on both the same way. If you've got those two assets and you fully patch that test asset, have you reduced risk in any way? Not really. You haven't touched that one that's more important in the business. Maybe you can't take it offline, or if you do, you've got to schedule those maintenance windows. You've got to coordinate with those additional teams. Both are great for running reports, organizing assets, querying, driving your scans. But we wanted a way to make even more use of those. And I mentioned the risk scoring just a moment ago. Really quickly, we use an approach where we look at exposure and time. We use an inbound CVSS score, version 2 or version 3, whatever is available for those asset or for those vulnerabilities when published. And V3 is taking over, but there's a lot of old vulnerabilities with V2. And we'll add a risk score to each vulnerability and a cumulative risk score to all your assets. Where the context comes in is you just tell us what's important to you, and you do that automatically. You don't have to go in and manually tag things. Create a dynamic asset group and assign a high criticality tag to it. Anything that fits the criteria that you set, we're going to go ahead and work with and respect. And it's great for those workflows, things like grouping of assets, driving those scans, creating ways to share that information, be it dashboards or goals or SLAs or remediation projects, things like that. But this becomes really important because those last two pieces help us build a program of scan orchestration. And what we didn't want as partners between Rapid7 and Medigate was a scenario where each of the solutions is doing what they do best. We are an active assessment technology. We can deploy agents to a list of supported OSs. Medigate offers deep packet inspection. It offers passive discovery and levels of risk assessment of those devices in a non-disruptive manner. And joining together, we wanted to make sure we're sharing context from one team to another across the solutions. And we're also driving that assessment, that understanding from a visibility perspective, and right down to the remediation of those assets, be it push button receive patch or mitigation or risk acceptance. So what we have is a scenario where Medigate will discover your full inventory, focusing on the medical devices and the IoT stuff, but it's going to listen to your network and let us know what's out there, what's working on the net at any given time. We're going to send those devices with their context over to Insight VM, which traditionally hasn't had some of that context. And it's no secret for folks who have used maybe a pure VM solution that it's very good at identifying, a lot of those industry standard user-centric devices and otherwise, but maybe not so good at the IoT and IOMT stuff. If it's on the network, you should scan it is a general saying, but when we get into the medical devices, what's the risk reward? There's a risk of potential disruption, and there's a relatively low reward of getting anything worth value back, any good context. So Metigate's going to identify those devices. It's going to identify some medical CVEs as well, when possible, and give you an understanding of the risk associated with those devices. It's going to send information over to Insight VM where we can start to orchestrate some of our scans. And I'll show you exactly that in the solutions themselves. We also, at the end, will have Metigate import vulnerabilities and exposures from Insight VM, because there's also this web of interconnectivity, right? There's that convergence of IT and IoT and OT and IOMT, where you need to understand the risk level of each one of those devices, but you also have to understand how they're talking to each other. If you've got fully buttoned up medical equipment, but you've got, a lot of folks will have XP and 7s, Windows still rolling around, or other embedded OSs, or just common workstations and servers that have some level of vulnerability. Those are talking to your devices. So you're going to want to go ahead and make sure that those are secured. So what I'll do is I'll actually just fire up each one of the solutions. I have timed out as I spoke, and I'm going to go ahead and log, and we're nice and secure. So we've got multi-factor, which is always good for everything except for a live demo. And just one moment. There we go. So I'll slide over to the Metigate interface, and there's, in the interest of time, I'll go pretty quickly. There's a lot more than I can cover in both of these solutions, but of course you can reach out to our teams, and we're happy to have that deeper conversation and walk through the tech. But if you look under risk and vulnerability scans in Metigate, you actually have a list of information from vulnerability management solutions, and in this case, Insight VM. And you see two tables on this page. One is scan targets, and the other is excluded devices. And this is really important because if you look at something like excluded devices, and I lack the permissions to go super deep here, but that's going to allow us to create lists of devices you don't ever want to scan. The true medical devices that are performing some kind of service in that clinical and that hospital environment, we don't want to disrupt them. We want to create a safety net so that when we go into our vulnerability scans, we're not causing any issues. And it's, the level of disruption might vary from device to device, but no disruption is really expected or allowed in a lot of these environments. So the excluded devices, and this is where the power of Metigate is really handy, is they're able to tell us based off of that passive inspection of the environment, here's what those devices are. In this case, for the excluded devices, I have a full list of infusion pumps, and I'm able to go in and look at all of the devices that match the criteria that Metigate automatically serves to me, including some that I might have taken out of rotation. But we've got 509 devices. We've got 266 live infusion pumps. In this case, a series of Alaris infusion pumps. What we also have is we've got a list of scan targets. And the scan targets allow you to craft either a static or a dynamic list of devices that you want to point scans at. You've got an exclusion workflow as part of that, the caveat being it's excluding it from that point and shoot scan. It's not creating that global exception or exclusion that you would do with the excluded devices. And what a lot of folks may do is say, look, I want to scan this 10-dot network or CIDR block or this particular floor, whatever it may be. You can point it at a subnet, you can point it at device criteria, and again, exclude things that carry that medical tag as assigned by Metigate. And what this will do is when we slide over to Insight VM, is we will create a site. Every site will have a prefix of Metigate so you can keep track of them. And the site, if we click into it, will have a list of things that are actionable or scannable from a vulnerability management perspective. So you have that full list of assets. But if you look at manage site, and again, this is built automatically for you, You can see this site is managed by Medigate. We don't want folks to have to go in and edit these. You get both the list of targets that are okay to scan, and you get the group of assets that you don't want to scan. We create both a site and an asset group from an exclusion perspective. The site's going to bundle all those things together. You can still report on them. You can look at some device metadata, but the asset group gets applied to every Medigate created site so that you're not accidentally scanning those things. Those are excluded. We don't have to worry about them. And if you look at that group, as I bounce back, you get that list of 509 excluded infusion pumps. And as you can see, no vulnerabilities. We're not actively scanning these. We wanted to exclude them. And I click into this top device here. You see that context that we sent over. So Medigate is discovering, the vendor, the make, the model, the device type, the application or software version. If there are clinical CVEs associated with it, those would pop up as well. And this is context that the IT team has not had. These are devices that only exist as maybe an IP address, a MAC address, or some embedded OS that shows up as unknown. And that's where they might poke and prod. They might run a discovery scan. They might run some type of scan to get better context of that device. And they're not able to. Now what we have is we've got information on that device. And the IT team knows, hey, not only should I not touch this, but it was done automatically. We created that, in essence, that wide net of all assets in the environment, but then very specifically pointed VM at the things that could be scanned and excluded the things that could not be scanned. So from actually one last piece of that is, and I mentioned on the previous slide, is sending that context back. Sending it over to the vuln management solution is not enough. We want to harvest some of that information on the Medigate side so that those teams can look at what we might have identified from active scans if possible. And the reason that's important is because while there is IoT and IOMT and IT, there's that convergence and there's a gray area of things that have a little bit of both. There are those scannable items that might live in between that might play a part in the interconnectivity between those devices. So we want to send that information back over and have it be folded into the overall clinical risk score that gets served in Medigate. A quick recap of the demonstration. And again, more than I could go through in just a few minutes. Step one, Medigate is going to passively discover that asset inventory. That clinical network is going to have a variety of devices, including the IT, the medical devices, the IoT devices. It's going to export the attributes and the devices over into Insight VM. So you have your scan targets, you have your assets, but you also have that clinical context that you didn't have otherwise. We're able to then orchestrate through that scanning process where, let's drive scans at, your traditional Windows and Linux devices while avoiding the medical devices. And those steps 3 and 4 kind of will flow on an ongoing basis, and the information will flow back into Medigate. So you have any additional risk context that is gleaned by the vulnerability management solution. So quick, but I hope helpful and hopefully enough to stir interest in maybe some next steps. But what I'll do now is turn it over to Todd for some real world scenarios and use cases on what we just talked about.
Great, thanks, Justin. Very well articulated. I'm just going to take a couple minutes and share at a high level how the integration of these two platforms has helped my team with our journey toward organizational vulnerability management and targeting a path to that 3.0 version that Thomas spoke to. Vulnerability scanning can be a challenge, especially in healthcare. We have unique challenges. We've got tons more IoT and IOMT devices, and many of those are fragile, as both Tom and Justin have spoken to. Even a mid-sized hospital will have thousands of clinical devices that may fall into this category well beyond our servers and our desktops. We have a lot of systems that may be vendor managed, those crossover systems that Justin was speaking about, and they're out of IT's control. But we still need to track vulnerabilities and try to reduce that throughout the organization. Many of us have struggled for years to keep tabs on the exact volume of these devices because their operating systems are usually not identified by the vulnerability scanners. And if your network has not been well organized into specific segments, or even if it has, if there's crossover or there's devices placed on the wrong segments, you're going to have several challenges trying to get your arms around all of these devices. First of all, the duration of your scans is going to take a lot more than you're going to expect it to. If you deploy 1 or 2 scanners based upon, solely on your desktop and your server counts, you're going to be surprised at how long your scans end up taking. Without knowing how many infusion pumps, glucose meters, pulse oximeters, EKG machines, et cetera, your scans are going to take a lot longer than you realized. And, number 2, not only will they take longer, but you're not going to get a lot of value from taking the time to scan those devices because most of them, like I said, aren't going to be identified correctly. And even the ones that do get identified, the data you get may be misleading. I've seen medical devices with a CentOS or Linux on a chip or Windows CE embedded operating systems that are identified as something different. And you may even think that they look like a vendor computer. And in reality, they're not a computer at all. They're an IoT or a clinical device. Being involved with patient care. Not being able to definitively understand what a device is will be a problem when you're trusting your vulnerability data and reporting on it. I like, Rapid7 is great at giving you a very measured vulnerability scores. And the last thing you want is to have that data skewed. Vulnerability scanners are licensed by the number of IP addresses. So you may have to buy thousands of additional licenses in order to try to scan the entirety of your IP scope. And by leveraging the data and the integration between your IoT management platform and your vulnerability scanner, like Justin was showing you in the demo, you can exclude those devices from your scan. You're going to reduce your licensing cost and your scan durations. And then by reducing that scope, you're going to reduce the number of engines that you have to deploy as well in order to manage your entire environment. And then as they've alluded to also, it is risky. The last thing you want to do is an exhaustive scan of an MRI machine with an embedded Windows operating system because it looks like a computer and it's actually performing a study on a patient. By leveraging the integration, you're protecting your patients by not communicating with those devices, especially when these devices are used sometimes around the clock in a provider environment. So when you leverage all of this integration from your different tools and allowing them to do what they do best and share their data, you're going to be getting more valuable data and improving the data in both of these platforms. I utilize my vulnerability scanner for allowing me to report on computer systems that both my organization owns and vendors own, and doing that well. And it's helping me with my clinical IoT devices and those crossover systems that Justin was speaking to. And I'm going to show you guys an example of that in just a minute. In many cases, we have vendor managed servers communicating with our IoT devices, and that overlap is real. Let's go to the next slide. So like it's been said, Medigate is doing packet inspection and passive listening, and it's reporting on everything that your IoT devices are communicating with. And one of the things that I saw initially was some of those are servers that actually fall out of the scope of IT management, but they're still on your network. And so understanding what is the real vulnerability on those systems and then working with the vendor relationship owners is really going to help you move your program in the right direction. Let's go ahead and go to my next slide. So this was interesting, and I just wanted to show this here, kind of highlight down here. things will pop up in your Medigate once you get this integration turned on between the two platforms. This was a printer that somebody in a shadow IT environment was evaluating. It ended up on our network. It was put on there with no a default password and not the latest firmware version, and it popped up in my Medigate dashboard. Now, you're going to be sharing data both ways, and you could leverage either platform for managing your vulnerabilities, however you want to do it. But sometimes you're going to live more in one console than the other, depending upon what you're doing. We all wear multiple hats in security, especially in healthcare. And I was in Medigate one day and happened to see that some of these printers showed up with very high risk scores, and they popped into Medigate. And Medigate wouldn't have known that it had a default password if it wasn't for the fact that Rapid7 scanned it. And so it showed up with an alert in Medigate with a risk score, and I appreciated that. I have alerting. I use Medigate with alerting, and I don't have alerting from my vulnerability scanner because it just doesn't make sense to me. But so I thought this was interesting. Let's go ahead and go to my next slide. And so this is to me, was a highlight of the crossover systems that Justin was talking about. When I first plugged Medigate in, there was a server that was managing our infusion pumps. And because Medigate is not actively scanning, it looked very, very vulnerable to me. It looked like it had Blue Keep, the WannaCry, NotPetya, all the major vulnerabilities. And I at first thought, I need to get a hold of, our biomed department and get the manager to reach out to the vendor and get this server patched, only to find out later that, oh, wait, no, when I went and scanned it with the vulnerability scanner, it wasn't that bad. It still had some vulnerabilities, but the data I was seeing in Medigate, because it's passive, it was just telling me what its potential vulnerabilities were, what its worst case scenario was. And now I can go into this crossover system, see the Rapid7 icon here in the IoT platform, and know that I have real vulnerability data that I can act on. It's not just a worst case scenario. So that provided a lot of value to me. So I just wanted to kind of just wrap it up with saying that when you're acting on actual scan data, you can verify, you can have the best of both worlds. And you're dealing with real data, and you're being more efficient in the way you're spending your time and your resources and your focus. Everything is orchestrated. You're doing things with the least amount of risk in the safest possible way, and getting the best possible data so that you can efficiently act. Information security, IT security and biomed, this is like, we're developing new processes for how we can work together and partner in managing these devices. And we're now helping them have conversations with their vendors and helping them play an active role in mitigating risks on these systems that we've pretty much been blind to for a lot of years. So I just wanted to say that this has been a great, great opportunity for us to develop these processes and develop these cross-functional workflows. Thanks.
Well, thanks again, Todd. Thanks for getting into the details there. I'm going to make a pivot right now and talk about really what the offer of this webinar is today, and that is something innovative that Medigate has developed that we refer to as the Convergence Maturity Assessment. If you take a look here at this graphic, you'll see that well, I'll back up and say that what we're really trying to do is provide a workable, integrated framework that blends security practices. Let's start over. Okay, sorry, you there? Beth? Where do you go? Beth? Beth? Well, thanks so much, Todd. I'm going to make a bit of a pivot here, and it cuts to the offer that we have at the end of today's webinar, where we are making available to attendees something that we refer to as the Convergence Maturity Assessment. It cuts right at the operational efficiency challenges that we've been discussing throughout this webinar. From Medigate's perspective, in order to construct a workable integrated framework, one that blends both security and asset management practices, it's necessary to blend security practices with operational processes and operational values. On the security side, while many frameworks exist, the NIST framework has been the most popular, I suppose, and it's important, I think, that we have selected it as it was recently endorsed by the recent passing of HR 7898 into law, also known now as the HIPAA Safe Harbor Law. The law, for those of you who don't know, amends the HITECH Act and essentially requires HHS to incentivize risk management best practices. Although compliance, if we're just talking about NIST alone, compliance to the NIST framework certainly does help mature a health system's cybersecurity posture. It does, in fact, fall short of measuring the goals set by more asset-centric staff like biomed and clinical engineering. On the other side here, when we talk in terms of operational processes and values, there are a number of ways to measure this. We have landed on Gartner's real-time health system model. It emerged a few years ago, and its relevancy is greater today than ever. It is directly focused on the kind of interoperability that we've been talking about. The research and recommendations provided by the Gartner RTHS are now being leveraged by health systems on their journey to operational efficiency. What we've done is blend in this convergence assessment, an online tool, the relevant controls from each for purposes of developing or delivering a gap analysis. And we say mind the gaps here because, and I'll say it this way, think about how much time has been spent, for example, securing the various silos that we're talking about trying to break now. Think in terms of the real risk beyond traditional cybersecurity risks associated with ransomware, data loss, data theft. The real risks are the gaps and efficiencies or the inefficiencies that exist between these silos. The report generates a benchmarked, fully detailed, basically 50-page report that not only begins, I can't show you all of that naturally here today, so I'm going to show you some sample output, begins by providing a high-level benchmarked view of where you are relative to your peers in terms of the gaps that we've just discussed. It highlights key areas of review, and underneath the key areas that are identified with those bars, the longer they are representing, the bigger the gap, we provide detailed prescriptive output. Again, the output is benchmarked. We'll flag, as you see on the right-hand slide here, when the area of concern is a matter of FSMA compliance. We will also, for example, where Medigate can help, deliver recommendations on how best to approach closing the gap. And at the end of the report, by NIST control, we provide you again a benchmarked assessment of where the gaps are the largest. Again, a very detailed report. We've gotten some great reviews in the marketplace based on clients that have adopted this, great endorsement as well from the analyst firms. We think this is something that was needed and is directly applicable to the converging interests of staff associated with asset management, as well as staff associated with security. So with that, let's go ahead and turn it over to questions. Let me see where we are. Some are coming in. Okay, Todd, we've got a question for you. Do you really see evidence that different stakeholder groups are in fact leveraging the same data, or are they still working in their same tools?
Yeah, I think for me in my organization, it's really just getting engaged with them. And what I'm finding is yes, I'm focused on vulnerability management, but when you get a lot of data that these platforms can provide you, you're going to find that you may get them into the console by saying, hey, can you look at these risky devices for me? Or can you get this firmware updated? Or, oh, hey, can you go? And look at something, because you're reaching out to them about managing risk and vulnerabilities. And when they can get into a platform like Medigate and see that, hey, I can see device utilization. I'm getting information about these devices that I've never seen before. Then they actually ask they want to invite other people to the platform. They're asking for more user IDs, and they're engaged just because they're getting visibility into things they've never seen about how these devices are utilized in the organization. And that's been a major draw and a win for me, is just to get them onto the platform. And now they're more engaged, and now they actually can see what I'm talking about, and they're actually more eager to help me.
Thanks, Todd. Justin, here's a good one for you. Given the kind of visibility that we talked about that's now available, do you see a time when medical devices can be scanned for vulnerabilities?
And taking the tact of actively scanned or actively assessed.
Yes.
I never say never, but probably not. I don't really see, it goes back to that concept of the risk reward. And it's not just from the scanner's perspective, right? You would need fingerprinting content, you need vulnerability checks or vulnerability coverage, security coverage of some kind from the vulnerability management solution. But you'd need a higher level of participation from the vendor, the medical device vendor side of things. And oftentimes with the IoTs and the IoMT devices, as I mentioned, it's not really a case of just update it to the latest and greatest, or run a firmware upgrade even. Sometimes it's lobby the vendor to support the solution. It might be an older device, it might be a very expensive device, and it might be a device that's used 24/7. So one of the words of caution always with medical devices is, hey, if you've got an extra one, scan it if it's not in use. Most teams don't really have extras. Everything's being put to use. And even if it's not currently in use, it needs to be available. Use could be imminent. And the last thing you want is to be running some kind of assessment that, when I talk about impact in the business, it's not always destructive, in the sense that it could just be tipping over a service. It could be rebooting a device. A lot of folks who have done vuln scans are familiar with it with printers, right? Printing out dingbats or resetting network settings. Can you just imagine doing that to some kind of medical device moments before it's pressed into action? Probably not. So that would be the word of caution there. So I don't see that happening, but fingers crossed, I guess.
All right, Todd, have you really experienced at Torrance a change to your vulnerability management practices as a result of this integration?
Yes, I would say the most obvious way is the partnership with Biomed and the integration with them, because they they immediately got a benefit in tracking in spending time looking for devices. Their mission is to service these IoMT or these medical IoT devices. And when they can't find them, they spend a lot of time looking for them. So they were sucked into the platform just out of utilizing efficiency. But in order for us to give them that visibility, then now I have asks of them. And when we see, a population of devices maybe that have two different versions of firmware, and one of them's more vulnerable than the other, they're actually, and they can see it, then they're very easy to export a list. And I say, hey, can you reach out to the vendor? They reach out to the vendor, and now they treat firmware upgrades just like they do as servicing the devices, because they acknowledge that this is a patient safety and a patient care issue. And now with this data, they're definitely more engaged with me. Absolutely.
I've got a good one that came in for me here, and it says, is the Convergence Maturity Assessment tool a substitute for a security risk assessment audit? And the answer is an emphatic no. This is not a substitute, but it is a very fresh and relevant perspective that makes not only the security risk assessment perhaps more relevant to a broader audience, but may have an impact on other stakeholders from a budgetary perspective in terms of what should be a priority going forward. So again, it's a perspective that seems to resonate with executive leadership. It is by no stretch of the imagination a auditable security audit. It surely does make sense in taking the assessment that its outputs are lined up, rationalized, and sequenced, if you will, with the output of your security risk assessment. The story there, the narrative should naturally flow together. I've got another question here about the Convergence Maturity Assessment. So I'll give it to you, Justin. Who should be involved in taking the assessment, and how do we get access to it? What's the process here?
Yeah, a great time to just flip to our second to last slide, which is, if you're listening and you're already working with folks from Medigate or Rapid7, just reach out to that team. If you're not, a couple contacts here that are monitored for inbound inquiries, and we're happy to provide the tool. We're happy to get on a call and do some Q&A and walk through it, maybe walk through some of the tech and the concepts that we looked at here today. But it's really, I'm guessing if you made it to this point, you'd be a good candidate to engage and take a look at the CMA. But if there's any doubt or questions about it, just reach out and we'll help you get to that next step. No problem at all.
Yeah, I just would want to add, probably pretty obvious here, but we'll work with you through the process. But the tool also, you can access it yourself. It has features in it that allow you to share various questions on the survey with appropriate people internally. Their answers can be reassembled automatically. Pretty neat stuff. Be thinking in terms of maybe someone from clinical engineering and someone from information security at a minimum being available to fill out the assessment. Anyway, relatively painless process for some pretty powerful output. Well, we'll wrap up there, and I want to thank everyone